Well, my parents were very culture-oriented and made sure that my brothers and I were exposed to visual and performing artists when we grew up in Ohio and Pennsylvania. And one thing that I remember is that in Columbus, Ohio, where I went to high school and where I started college, there was a craft store, a fine craft store called Helen Whittemore. And it was in a beautiful little Victorian house. And when you went in, they automatically offered you a cup of tea. It was very genteel. And they had fine ceramics and glassware, textiles and jewelry displayed for you to buy. But they also had drawers, and you could look through the drawers. You know how the motto in a museum is don't touch, and in a lot of stores it's don't touch, but here you could touch and explore. And I think this really sparked my interest. And recently I had the occasion to Google Helen Whittemore's, and I found that it was one of the earliest fine craft stores in the United States. And then when I went on to study in college and I studied different cultures, my interest was on material culture and their objects, and that leads to museum work. Work in different museums. Well, my first real job was working in the Children's Museum in Indianapolis, which is one of the finest children's museums in the country. It's object-based, and they have the most amazing objects from science and technology to Indiana history to amazing ethnography from all over the world. And the museum had been closed for 7 years as it was building a new huge building, which has now been extended several times. But during those 7 years they continued to collect objects. And I worked there in the summer as a collections assistant, and we were given free reign of a storage room into which the new objects were assigned. And it was like a marathon of cataloging and researching and learning about these objects and documenting them. And that's where I learned a lot of my skills of how to handle and how to care for and how to transport and how to document and write down objects. And a few years later I was at a meeting of the American Association of Museums, and a young lady, about my age, came up to me and she goes, "You're Annette Fromm, you did all that cataloging that summer." And I just couldn't tell her how much I loved doing that.
Wow.
Then I worked in Cleveland, Ohio in a small multi-ethnic museum in the late 70s. And it was the time when museums were looking at ethnicity and cultural diversity, and it introduced me to Cleveland, Ohio and the ethnic communities there, and it was just tons of fun to see the backside of festivals and cooking and craft making and community growth and such. Do you want one more story? Let me think. I had the opportunity in Greece to work with a friend who was developing a folklore museum in the city of Arta, which is in the northwest, middle northwest kind of, a very historic city. And she was given a building that had been the customs building on the border between Greece and the Ottoman Empire in the mid-19th century, and how we worked with the local workmen to transform it into a really beautiful and lovely museum that expressed the traditional culture of the rural areas and of the city. Not so good is hard to answer, because when you're a museum professional you learn the best practices and the best way things are done. And one of my fondest experiences was to be in a very small community museum somewhere in northern Ohio. I honestly don't remember where. And it was a Quonset hut. It's one of these metal temporary military sort of semicircular buildings. And inside they had floor-to-ceiling display cases, just making aisles and aisles. And everybody in town had put their collections into this place, and it was the town museum. And as a professional, you looked at it and you thought, oh my gosh, this is just horrible. The display techniques, the climate control. But then on the other hand, you think, look at the pride of the community that community members put their items that they've collected lovingly on display for everybody to see. So you can see bad, but also bad practices, or not standard practices, but then see how they're doing wonderful work. One of my favorite museums is a museum that is changing today, and it's the Tropen Museum, the Tropical Institute Museum in Amsterdam. When you go to Amsterdam, everyone goes to the Rijksmuseum and the Van Gogh Museum and the Anne Frank House, and a little further out at the Tropical Institute, which is a colonial institute of the Dutch colonies, which is kind of not a very popular term these days. The public and the profession is becoming critical of exhibits that show colonial splendor and not really the people and how they were being affected. But the Tropen Museum, I thought, had really remarkable exhibits that delved into everyday life of everyday people around the world. And seeing a street scene from India in which the market stalls were set up, and there was sound and light and smells, and you felt like you were immersed in this community, not just seeing ethnographic objects on a shelf with an explanation. Other exhibits went into people's homes, and there was a display case like a bookshelf in the library. And not only were there books there, but emerging from there were videos of the people that lived there talking about it. So they were making the exhibits very personally oriented. And that's a museum that I really enjoy a lot, and I think their exhibits, their educational programs are very innovative. It's been my pleasure for the last maybe 20 years to be able to teach museum studies at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma, and then here at FIU. And there's lots of advice that I give, and I'm sure the students are tired of it. But I think it's to find your passion and to work with high integrity and ethics, and to keep in mind the stories that you want to tell with remarkable artwork, whether it's fine art or history documents or science specimens or ethnographic objects, and to involve people in what you're showing, which is the trend in museology today, both those people whose stories you're telling and those people who are coming in, so that there can be more involvement in the art rather, and the documents and historic objects, rather than just looking at them, but seeing how they impact the visitor and how they come from real people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.